Scripture tells us that we will all inevitably endure suffering in our own lives. But for those of us in medicine, our proximity to daily suffering is unique. Many clinicians pursue vocations in the field of medicine because they hear, as physician and philosopher Jeffrey Bishop puts it, the call of the suffering other. That suffering is immediate, tangible, and constant in the world of medicine. There's little doubt that this contributes to the burnout being experienced today by so many in medicine, as well as a renewed emphasis on practitioner empathy. But as has often been repeated, compassion means not merely the exercise of kindness and empathy in the face of burnout, but the practice of co-passio, in Latin, literally co-suffering, as we heal. As Christians, we may sense the challenge of this all the more acutely as we learn to see that the patients for whom we care are not mere recipients of medical intervention, but are fellow children of God, neighbors, whose suffering we are called to share rather than merely to fix. As Christians in medicine, we must recognize that there are wise ways to respond to suffering, just as there are foolish and unhealthy ways to respond. There are three temptations in particular which are essential for Christians to consider in the face of suffering: those of dismissal, detachment, and despair. First, consider the temptation to dismiss or gloss over suffering. There's a tendency in Western Christianity to grow uncomfortable with the pain of others and search for a bright word of hope or a quick solution or fix. Like Job's friends, we are willing to sit with the suffering, but only for so long. This proves problematic when we consider that in following Christ, we follow a man of sorrows. It can be easy as Christians in medicine to resort to easy theological one-liners that ultimately leave the suffering hurting worse than before. Often we are uncomfortable acknowledging suffering for what it is, and turn instead to giving reasons for suffering. As theologian and church historian Kate Bowler writes in her memoir, Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved, which she wrote after being diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer, the only thing worse than throwing a drowning person a life preserver is offering them a reason. Author Alexi Sargent puts it more directly. The Bible, though full of good news, is often notably not perky. The all joy, all the time model is not only insufficiently biblical, it can leave entire groups of Christians out in the cold. When we gloss over the suffering of others, we fail to recognize the reality of a broken world that is not easily mended, forgetting that Jesus himself wept at the death of Lazarus and was distraught by his own suffering in Gethsemane. Christ himself cries what the Greek translate as hot and angry tears at the death and suffering of the world. When our patients or colleagues are suffering, perhaps we should learn to first share tears before we offer reasons. Second, consider the temptation of detachment. Given the repetitive nature of witnessing pain in medical work, there's a real temptation to detach ourselves from suffering. This may be part of the reason that some of the practices of Buddhism have become so attractive to many medical workers. Buddhists understand that all of life is suffering, and to escape it, one must free oneself of the desire for things to not suffer. There's some wisdom in this. To some degree, all in medicine must hone the ability to avoid becoming professionally incapacitated by the suffering we witness. A bit of stoicism is healthy in medicine and shares common ground with Christianity, such as we see in the book of Ecclesiastes. Yet if we are not careful, this may quickly evolve into a sense of numbness, white-knuckled grit, and detachment as we compartmentalize the experiences of our patients as distinct from ourselves. Some may consider this response an adaptive one. To be sure, we are able to practice more efficiently when we don't allow mourning to interrupt our workflow. Yet as Christians, we recognize that Christ was deeply moved by the sick he encountered, and indeed identifies with them. The third temptation is that of despair. The brutal fact of bodily life is that all bodies fail and break down. Every human being we diagnose or treat, every baby delivered, every hand held will die. When we witness the recurrent and sometimes unrelenting suffering that this reality brings, as we watch healthy bodies grow sick, or sick bodies remain unwell despite our best medicine, we may find ourselves overcome with grief, frustration, and anger. In many ways, these emotions are a fitting response to suffering. It is normal to find the death of a patient deeply painful. It is also the case that this grief may easily give way to a posture of despair at the unfairness of life, the absurdity of sin, the inevitability of suffering, and our own inability to fix it. This may well be the most common way that today's medical workers respond to pain, not with detachment or dismissal, but with despair turned into cynicism and fatalism. It doesn't take long to realize that the bio-psycho-social spiritual model of medicine, broad as it is, cannot and does not solve the problem of pain. It merely gives us categories to organize our efforts in a long defeat. On a deeper level, as Christians, we may feel a unique sense of frustration and despair as we wonder why a good God who promises to help and heal seems silent among the suffering of those who appear to need him most. This temptation can become what Old Testament scholar Ellen Davis names as the dirge, an inwardly directed echo chamber of rage and self-pity in the face of life's absurdities, cut off from both God and community. What then are distinctively Christian ways that we respond to suffering faithfully? In the face of dismissal, detachment, and despair, one uniquely Christian response available to us is lament. Lament is a distinctively Judeo-Christian idea, one that allows us to both honestly name the suffering we encounter while also practicing trust that the Lord hears our cries. The best examples of lament in Scripture are, of course, the Psalms. While we tend to associate these poems with praise, and we rightly should, it is telling that the majority of the Psalms are psalms of imprecation or anger and lament. Ellen Davis calls this the Psalms' rigorous honesty, such as Psalm 139 or 109. For I am poor and needy, and my heart is wounded within me. I fade away like an ever-evening shadow. My knees give way, my body is thin and gaunt. These psalms force us to confront our own pain and anger while simultaneously freeing us to express to God what we really think, rather than trying to sugarcoat our thoughts before coming to him. In other words, the Psalms train us to take suffering seriously. They provide an important framework for an honest conveyance of our deepest pains and temptations to despair, with the knowledge that such cries are heard by a God who will not break a bruised reed. While dismissal too easily moves past suffering with trite optimism, lament takes suffering seriously while also telling the truth about the God who promises to make all the sad things come untrue. While detachment leaves the sufferer alone in their pain, lament is willing to sit in the ash and co-suffer in silence. While the dirge of despair is isolated and perpetuates cynicism, lament brings our honest and raw feelings before the Lord and in communion with others, weak and withered and half-hearted as our trust and hope in those moments might be. Lament refuses to give suffering the dignity of clean, simplistic explanations, while also refusing to look away. Lament refuses foolish hope and instead demands a Christ-centered hope. Lament means that when we find our patients, our loved ones, or ourselves in Psalm 40's slimy pit or Psalm 6's bed wetted with tears, we cry out, confident that our Creator, Sustainer, and Redeemer hears, grieves, and remains steadfast. The Christian practice of lament allows us as medical workers to exhibit grief that is honest and grounded in faith, with the knowledge that the Lord's enduring promises are true, that his word will not return void, even in those painful instances in which, darkness is my only friend. My bones burn like glowing embers, and outwardly we are wasting away. And even when the sorrow seems particularly long, we have hope. As Christ said, truly, truly, I say to you, you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. You will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will turn into joy. We as Christians in medicine must hold on to this promise and serve as witnesses to this hope, even and especially during those moments of darkness that threaten to overwhelm us.